The Conservation of Races by W.E. Burkhart du Bois, 1897. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Announcement. The American Negro Academy believes that upon those of the race who have had the advantages of higher education and culture rests the responsibility of taking concerted steps for the employment of these agencies to uplift the race to higher planes of thought and action. Two great obstacles to this consummation are apparent: A. The lack of unity, want of harmony, absence of self-sacrificing spirit, and no well-defined line of policy seeking definite aims; and B. The persistent, relentless, at times covert opposition employed to thwart the Negro at every step of his upward struggles to establish the justness of his claim to the highest physical, intellectual, and moral possibilities. The Academy will, therefore, from time to time, publish such papers as, in their judgment, aid, by their broad and scholarly treatment of the topics discussed, the dissemination of principles tending to the growth and development of the Negro along right lines, and the vindication of that race against vicious assaults. The American Negro Academy Occasional Papers, No. 2. The Conservation of Races. The American Negro has always felt an intense personal interest in discussions as to the origins and destinies of races, primarily because back of most discussions of race with which he is familiar have lurked certain assumptions as to his natural abilities, as to his political, intellectual, and moral status, which he felt were wrong. He has consequently been led to deprecate and minimize race distinctions, to believe intensely that out of one blood God created all nations, and to speak of human brotherhood as though it were the possibility of an already dawning tomorrow. Nevertheless, in our calmer moments, we must acknowledge that human beings are divided into races, that in this country the two most extreme types of the world's races have met, and the resulting problem as to the future relations of these types is not only of intense and living interest to us, but forms an epoch in the history of mankind. It is necessary, therefore, in planning our movements, in guiding our future development, that at times we rise above the pressing but smaller questions of separate schools and cars, wage discrimination and lynch law, to survey the whole question of race in human philosophy, and to lay on a basis of broad knowledge and careful insight those large lines of policy and higher ideals which may form our guiding lines and boundaries in the practical difficulties of every day. For it is certain that all human striving must recognize the hard limits of natural law, and that any striving, no matter how intense and earnest, which is against the constitution of the world is vain. The question, then, which we must seriously consider is this: what is the real meaning of race? What has in the past been the law of race development, and what lessons has the past history of race development to teach the rising Negro people? When we thus come to inquire into the essential difference of races, we find it hard to come at once to any definite conclusion. Many criteria of race differences have in the past been proposed, as color, hair, cranial measurements, and language, and manifestly in each of these respects human beings differ widely. They vary in color, for instance, from the marble-like pallor of the Scandinavian to the rich dark brown of the Zulu, passing by the creamy Slav, the yellow Chinese, the light brown Sicilian, and the brown Egyptian. Men vary too in the texture of hair, from the obstinately straight hair of the Chinese to the obstinately tufted and frizzled hair of the Bushman. In measurement of heads, again, men vary from the broad-headed Tartar to the medium-headed European and the narrow-headed Hottentot, or again in language from the highly inflected Roman tongue to the monosyllabic Chinese. All of these physical characteristics are patent enough, and if they agreed with each other, it would be very easy to classify mankind. Unfortunately for scientists, however, these criteria of race are most exasperatingly intermingled. Color does not agree with texture of hair, for many of the dark races have straight hair. Nor does color agree with the breadth of the head, for the yellow Tartar has a broader head than the German. Nor again has the science of language as yet succeeded in clearing up the relative authority of these various and contradictory criteria. The final word of science so far is that we have at least two, perhaps three great families of human beings, the whites and Negroes, possibly the yellow race. That other races have arisen from the intermingling of the blood of these two. This broad division of the world's races, which men like Huxley and Ratzel have introduced as more nearly true than the old five-race scheme of Blumenbach, is nothing more than an acknowledgement that so far as purely physical characteristics are concerned, the differences between men do not explain all the differences of their history. It declares, as Darwin himself said, that great as is the physical unlikeness of the various races of men, their likenesses are greater, and upon this rests the whole scientific doctrine of human brotherhood. Although the wonderful developments of human history teach that the grosser physical differences of color, hair, and bone go but a short way toward explaining the different roles which groups of men have played in human progress, yet there are differences, subtle, delicate, elusive though they may be, which have silently but definitely separated men into groups. While these subtle forces have generally followed the natural cleavage of common blood, descent, and physical peculiarities, they have at other times swept across and ignored these. At all times, however, they have divided human beings into races which, while they perhaps transcend scientific definition, nevertheless are clearly defined to the eye of the historian and sociologist. If this be true, then the history of the world is the history not of individuals but of groups, not of nations but of races, and he who ignores or seeks to override the race idea in human history ignores and overrides the central thought of all history. What then is a race? It is a vast family of human beings, generally of common blood and language, always of common history, traditions, and impulses, who are both voluntarily and involuntarily striving together for the accomplishment of certain more or less vividly conceived ideals of life. Turning to real history, there can be no doubt, first, as to the widespread, nay, universal prevalence of the race idea, the race spirit, the race ideal, and as to its efficiency as the vastest and most ingenious invention for human progress. We who have been reared and trained under the individualistic philosophy of the Declaration of Independence and the laissez-faire philosophy of Adam Smith are loath to see and loath to acknowledge this patent fact of human history. We see the Pharaohs, Caesars, Toussaint, and Napoleons of history and forget the vast races of which they were but epitomized expressions. We are apt to think in our American impatience that while it may have been true in the past that closed race groups made history, that here in conglomerate America, nous avons changé tout cela. We have changed all that, and have no need of this ancient instrument of progress. This assumption, of which the Negro people are especially fond, cannot be established by a careful consideration of history. We find upon the world's stage today 8 distinctly differentiated races, in the sense in which history tells us the word must be used. They are the Slavs of Eastern Europe, the Teutons of Middle Europe, the English of Great Britain and America, the Romance nations of Southern and Western Europe, the Negroes of Africa and America, the Semitic people of Western Asia and Northern Africa, the Hindus of Central Asia, and the Mongolians of Eastern Asia. There are, of course, other minor race groups as the American Indians, the Esquimaux, and the South Sea Islanders. These larger races, too, are far from homogeneous. The Slav includes the Czech, the Magyar, the Pole, and the Russian. The Teuton includes the German, the Scandinavian, and the Dutch. The English include the Scotch, the Irish, and the conglomerate American. Under Romance nations, the widely differing Frenchman, Italian, Sicilian, and Spaniard are comprehended. The term Negro is perhaps the most indefinite of all, combining the mulattoes and Zambois of America and the Egyptians, Bantus and Bushmen of Africa. Among the Hindus are traces of widely differing nations, while the great Chinese, Tartar, Korean, and Japanese families fall under the one designation, Mongolian. The question now is, what is the real distinction between these nations? Is it the physical differences of blood, color, and cranial measurements? Certainly we must all acknowledge that physical differences play a great part, and that with wide exceptions and qualifications, these 8 great races of today follow the cleavage of physical race distinctions. The English and Teuton represent the white variety of mankind, the Mongolian the yellow, the Negroes, the black. Between these are many crosses and mixtures, where Mongolian and Teuton have blended into the Slav, and other mixtures have produced the Romance nations and the Semites. But while race differences have followed mainly physical race lines, yet no mere physical distinctions would really define or explain the deeper differences, the cohesiveness and continuity of these groups. The deeper differences are spiritual, psychical differences, undoubtedly based on the physical, but infinitely transcending them. The forces that bind together the Teuton nations are then, first, their race identity and common blood; secondly, and more important, a common history, common laws and religion, similar habits of thought, and a conscious striving together for certain ideals of life. The whole process which has brought about these race differentiations has been a growth, and the great characteristic of this growth has been the differentiation of spiritual and mental differences between great races of mankind, and the integration of physical differences. The age of nomadic tribes of closely related individuals represents the maximum of physical differences. They are practically vast families, and there were as many groups as families. As the families came together to form cities, the physical differences lessened, purity of blood was replaced by the requirement of domicile, and all who lived within the city bounds became gradually to be regarded as members of the group, i.e., there was a slight and slow breaking down of physical barriers. This, however, was accompanied by an increase of the spiritual and social differences between cities. This city became husbandmen, this merchants, another warriors, and so on. The ideals of life for which the different cities struggled were different. When at last cities began to coalesce into nations, there was another breaking down of barriers which separated groups of men. The larger and broader differences of color, hair, and physical proportions were not by any means ignored, but myriads of minor differences disappeared, and the sociological and historical races of men began to approximate the present division of races as indicated by physical researches. At the same time, the spiritual and physical differences of race groups which constituted the nations became deep and decisive. The English nation stood for constitutional liberty and commercial freedom, the German nation for science and philosophy, the Romance nation stood for literature and art, and the other race groups are striving, each in its own way, to develop for civilization its particular message, its particular ideal, which shall help to guide the world nearer and nearer that perfection of human life for which we all long, that, quote, one far-off divine event, unquote. This has been the function of race differences up to the present time. What shall be its function in the future? Manifestly, some of the great races of today, particularly the Negro race, have not as yet given to civilization the full spiritual message which they are capable of giving. I will not say that the Negro race has as yet given no message to the world, for it is still a mooted question among scientists as to just how far Egyptian civilization was Negro in its origin. If it was not wholly Negro, it was certainly very closely allied. Be that as it may, however, the fact still remains that the full, complete Negro message of the whole Negro race has not as yet been given to the world, that the messages and ideal of the yellow race have not been completed, and that the striving of the mighty Slavs has but begun. The question is, then, how shall the message be delivered? How shall these various ideals be realized? The answer is plain: by the development of these race groups, not as individuals but as races. For the development of Japanese genius, Japanese literature and art, Japanese spirit, only Japanese bound and welded together, Japanese inspired by one vast ideal, can work out in its fullness the wonderful message which Japan has for the nations of the earth. For the development of Negro genius, a Negro literature and art, of Negro spirit, only Negroes bound and welded together. Negroes inspired by one vast ideal can work out in its fullness the great message we have for humanity. We cannot reverse history. We are subject to the same natural laws as other races. And if the Negro is ever to be a factor in the world's history, if among the gaily colored banners that deck the broad ramparts of civilization is to hang one uncompromising black, then it must be placed there by black hands, fashioned by black heads, and hallowed by the travail of 200 million black hearts beating in one glad song of jubilee. For this reason, the advance guard of the Negro people, the 8 million people of Negro blood in the United States of America, must soon come to realize that if they are to take their just place in the van of pan-Negroism, then their destiny is not absorption by the white Americans. That if in America it is to be proven for the first time in the modern world that not only Negroes are capable of evolving individual men like Toussaint, the savior, but are a nation stored with wonderful possibilities of culture, then their destiny is not a servile imitation of Anglo-Saxon culture, but a stalwart originality which shall unswervingly follow Negro ideals. It may, however, be objected here that the situation of our race in America renders this attitude impossible, that our sole hope of salvation lies in our being able to lose our race identity in the commingled blood of the nation, and that any other course would merely increase the friction of races, which we call race prejudice, and against which we have so long and so earnestly fought. Here, then, is the dilemma, and it is a puzzling one, I admit. No Negro who has given earnest thought to the situation of his people in America has failed at some time in life to find himself at these crossroads, has failed to ask himself at some time, what, after all, am I? Am I an American, or am I a Negro? Can I be both? Or is it my duty to cease to be a Negro as soon as possible and be an American? If I strive as a Negro, am I not perpetuating the very cleft that threatens and separates black and white America? Is not my only possible practical aim the subduction of all that is Negro in me to the American? Does my black blood place upon me any more obligation to assert my nationality than German or Irish or Italian blood would? It is such incessant self-questioning and the hesitation that arises from it that is making the present period a time of vacillation and contradiction for the American Negro. Combined race action is stifled, race responsibility is shirked, race enterprises languish, and the best blood, the best talent, the best energy of the Negro people cannot be marshaled to do the bidding of the race. They stand back to make room for every rascal and demagogue who chooses to cloak his selfish deviltry under the veil of race pride. Is this right? Is it rational? Is it good policy? Have we in America a distinct mission as a race, a distinct sphere of action and an opportunity for race development? Or is self-obliteration the highest end to which Negro blood dare aspire? If we carefully consider what race prejudice really is, we find it historically to be nothing but the friction between different groups of people. It is the difference in aim, in feeling, in ideals of two different races. If now this difference exists touching territory, laws, language, or even religion, it is manifest that these people cannot live in the same territory without fatal collision. But if, on the other hand, there is substantial agreement in laws, language, and religion, if there is a satisfactory adjustment of economic life, then there is no reason why in the same country and on the same street 2 or 3 great national ideals might not thrive and develop, that men of different races might not strive together for their race ideals as well, perhaps even better than in isolation. Here, it seems to me, is the reading of the riddle that puzzles so many of us. We are Americans, not only by birth and by citizenship, but by our political ideals, our language, our religion. Farther than that, our Americanism does not go. At that point, we are Negroes, members of a vast historic race that from the very dawn of creation has slept, but half awakening in the dark forests of its African fatherland. We are the first fruits of this new nation, the harbinger of that black tomorrow which is yet destined to soften the whiteness of the Teutonic today. We are that people whose subtle sense of song has given America its only American music, its only American fairy tales, its only touch of pathos and humor amid its mad money-getting plutocracy. As such, it is our duty to conserve our physical powers, our intellectual endowments, our spiritual ideals. As a race, we must strive by race organization, by race solidarity, by race unity to the realization of that broader humanity which freely recognizes differences in men, but sternly deprecates inequality in their opportunities of development. For the accomplishment of these ends, we need race organizations, Negro colleges, Negro newspapers, Negro business organizations, a Negro school of literature and art, and an intellectual clearinghouse for all these products of the Negro mind, which we may call a Negro Academy. Not only is all this necessary for positive advance, it is absolutely imperative for negative defense. Let us not deceive ourselves that our situation in this country, weighted with a heritage of moral iniquity from our past history, hard pressed in the economic world by foreign immigrants and native prejudice, hated here, despised there, and pitied everywhere, our one haven of refuge is ourselves, and but one means of advance, our own belief in our great destiny, our own implicit trust in our ability and worth. There is no power under God's high heaven that can stop the advance of 8,000 honest, earnest, inspired, and united people. But, and here is the rub, they must be honest, fearlessly criticizing their own faults, zealously correcting them. They must be earnest. No people that laughs at itself and ridicules itself and wishes to God it was anything but itself ever wrote its name in history. It must be inspired with the divine faith of our black mothers, that out of the blood and dust of battle will march a victorious host, a mighty nation, a peculiar people, to speak to the nations of earth a divine truth that shall make them free. And such a people must be united, not merely united for the organized theft of political spoils, not united to disgrace religion with whoremongers and ward healers, not united merely to protest and pass resolutions, but united to stop the ravages of consumption among the Negro people, united to keep black boys from loafing, gambling, and crime, united to guard the purity of black women and to reduce that vast army of black prostitutes that is today marching to hell, and united in serious organizations to determine by careful conference and thoughtful interchange of opinion the broad lines of policy and action for the American Negro. This is the reason for being which the American Negro Academy has. It aims at once to be the epitome and expression of the intellect of the black-blooded people of America, the exponent of the race ideals of one of the world's great races. As such, the Academy must, if successful, be A. representative in character, B. impartial in conduct, C. firm in leadership. It must be representative in character, not in that it represents all interests of all factions, but in that it seeks to comprise something of the best thought, the most unselfish striving, and the highest ideals. There are scattered in forgotten nooks and corners throughout the land Negroes of some considerable training, of high minds and high motives, who are unknown to their fellows, who exert far too little influence. These the Negro Academy should strive to bring into touch with each other and to give them a common mouthpiece. The Academy should be impartial in conduct. While it aims to exalt the people, it should aim to do so by truth, not by lies, by honesty, not by flattery. It should continually impress the fact upon the Negro people that they must not expect to have things done for them. They must do for themselves, that they have on their hands a vast work of self-reformation to do, and that a little less complaint and whining and a little more dogged work and manly striving would do us more credit and benefit than 1,000 force or civil rights bills. Finally, the American Negro Academy must point out a practical path of advance to the Negro people. There lie before every Negro today hundreds of questions of policy and right which must be settled, and which each one settles now, not in accordance with any rule but by impulse or individual preference. For instance, what should be the attitude of Negroes toward the educational qualification for voters? What should be our attitude towards separate schools? How should we meet discriminations on railways and in hotels? Such questions need not so much specific answers for each part as a general expression of policy, and nobody should be better fitted to announce such a policy than a representative, honest Negro Academy. All this, however, must come in time after careful organization and long conference. The immediate work before us should be practical and have direct bearing upon the situation of the Negro. The historical work of collecting the laws of the United States and of the various states of the Union with regard to the Negro is a work of such magnitude and importance that no body but one like this could think of undertaking it. If we could accomplish that one task, we would justify our existence. In the field of sociology, an appalling work lies before us. First, we must unflinchingly and bravely face the truth, not with apologies, but with solemn earnestness. The Negro Academy ought to sound a note of warning that would echo in every black cabin in the land. Unless we conquer our present vices, They will conquer us. We are diseased, we are developing criminal tendencies, and an alarmingly large percentage of our men and women are sexually impure. The Negro Academy should stand and proclaim this over the housetops, crying with garrison, "I will not equivocate. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard." The Academy should seek to gather about it the talented, unselfish men, the pure and noble-minded women, to fight an army of devils that disgraces our manhood and our womanhood. There does not stand today upon God's earth a race more capable in muscle, in intellect, in morals than the American Negro, if he will bend his energies in the right direction, if he will burst his birth's invidious bar, and grasp the skirts of happy chance, and breast the blows of circumstance, and grapple with his evil star. In science and morals I have indicated 2 fields of work for the Academy. Finally, in practical policy, I wish to suggest the following Academy creed. 1. We believe that the Negro people as a race have a contribution to make to civilization and humanity which no other race can make. 2. We believe it the duty of the Americans of Negro descent as a body to maintain their race identity until this mission of the Negro people is accomplished and the ideal of human brotherhood has become a practical possibility. 3. We believe that unless modern civilization is a failure, it is entirely feasible and practicable for 2 races in such essential political, economic, and religious harmony as the white and colored people of America, to develop side by side in peace and mutual happiness the peculiar contribution which each has to make to the culture of their common country. 4. As a means to this end, we advocate not such social equality between these races as would disregard human likes and dislikes, but such a social equilibrium as would, throughout all the complicated relations of life, give due and just consideration to culture, ability, and moral worth, whether they be found under white or black skins. 5. We believe that the first and greatest step toward the settlement of the present friction between the races, commonly called the Negro problem, lies in the correction of the immorality, crime, and laziness among the Negroes themselves, which still remains as a heritage from slavery. We believe that only earnest and long-continued efforts on our own part can cure these social ills. 6. We believe that the second great step toward a better adjustment of the relations between the races should be a more impartial selection of ability in the economic and intellectual world, and a greater respect for personal liberty and worth regardless of race. We believe that only earnest efforts on the part of the white people of this country will bring much-needed reform in these matters. 7. On the basis of the foregoing declaration and firmly believing in our high destiny, we as American Negroes are resolved to strive in every honorable way for the realization of the best and highest aims, for the development of strong manhood and pure womanhood, and for the rearing of a race ideal in America and Africa to the glory of God and the uplifting of the Negro people. End of The Conservation of Races by W. E. Burkhardt Du Bois, 1897.